The sun beat down mercilessly on the dry plains of the frontier. Cracks split the ground like scars, and every breath of wind carried with it a sting of dust. Leaned against his shovel and wiped the sweat from his brow. Life had not been kind to him. His cattle had dwindled, his crops had withered, and his small wooden house creaked like it was tired of standing. Yet every morning, Thomas rose with a stubborn will, determined to hold on to what little he had left. That morning, as he fetched water from the well, his most precious treasure, he noticed something unusual by the fence. A figure lay collapsed in the dirt, half hidden in the brush. Thomas's heart quickened. At first, he thought it was a stray drifter or perhaps a thief. But as he came closer, the truth struck him like a hammer. It was a native warrior, badly wounded. His skin blistered from the sun, lips cracked with thirst. Thomas froze. He knew the dangers. The warrior's chest rose shallowly, his eyes half open with pain. The rancher knelt, his weathered hands trembling as he lifted a bucket. He hesitated. That water was meant for his own survival. Every drop counted. Yet his conscience weighed heavier than his thirst. "Easy now," Thomas muttered, tipping the bucket gently so the cool liquid touched the man's lips. The warrior gasped, drinking desperately, water running down his chin into the parched soil. His land was silent, but the silence felt alive. Perhaps in the distant hills, someone was watching. Perhaps his decision today would bring a storm tomorrow. Still, he did not stop. He poured until the bucket was empty, knowing full well he had just risked everything for a stranger. The wounded man looked at him with a mixture of shock and gratitude. No words were spoken. Thomas did not know who this man was or where he came from. What Thomas could never imagine was that this single act, giving water in the desert, would echo far beyond that moment. For in the distance, beyond the dust and heat, entire tribes had already heard the cries of their fallen warrior, and they were coming. The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the desert sky with strokes of orange and crimson. Samuel, the poor rancher, sat on the porch of his weathered shack, his heart still racing from what he had done earlier that day. He had poured the last of his precious water into the mouth of a man the world called his enemy. His own lips were cracked, his throat dry as sand. But something deep inside told him he had done what was right. The wounded native lay resting inside the barn, his breath shallow but steadier than before. Samuel had dragged him there after giving him water, cleaned the blood from his side, and covered him with an old horse blanket. Every sound outside made Samuel jump, the cry of a crow, the creak of a board, the faint rustle of the wind. He knew the danger. If the warrior's people discovered him harboring one of their own, they might see it not as mercy but as an insult. Still, Samuel could not bring himself to regret it. That night, he barely slept. Memories of his late wife haunted him, how she used to say, "Kindness costs more than gold. Sam, but it's worth more too," those words echoed. Now as he watched the faint glow of the moonlight on the desert sands, the ranch was silent, except for the weak moans of the stranger inside. By dawn, the air had changed. Samuel stepped outside and noticed dust rising far off on the horizon. His stomach tightened. One horse became 3, 3 became 10, then dozens. The sky seemed to darken with the silhouettes of mounted warriors, their feathers catching the morning light like flames. His hands trembled as he gripped the railing of his porch. He counted not one tribe, but many, warriors in long lines, their faces stern, their eyes sharp as arrows. The earth shook beneath their weight. Samuel knew instantly they were not here by accident. They had come for the man in his barn, and perhaps for him. The sun dipped lower, bleeding red across the desert sky, and silence wrapped the ranch in an uneasy stillness. The poor rancher sat on the dry earth outside his shack, staring at the wounded native man resting against the wall. He had given him water, the last he could spare, and patched his wounds with torn pieces of cloth. Still, fear lingered in his chest like a stone. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself, hands trembling. "If his people find him here, they'll think I held him captive. They'll think I harmed him." The rancher's mind wrestled with images of warriors on horseback, arrows flying, flames consuming his tiny wooden home. As dusk deepened, the wounded man stirred. His eyes opened, dark and heavy with pain, but in them was something unexpected, gratitude. He tried to speak, his voice cracked. his words faint in a tongue the rancher barely understood. The rancher leaned closer, catching only fragments, but he could tell the man wasn't cursing him. He was thanking him. The rancher sat back, stunned. He had braced himself for anger, even violence, but instead he saw a flicker of peace. Night fell quickly. Coyotes howled from the hills, and the rancher lit a small lantern inside his shack. The wounded man dozed near the doorway, while the rancher paced restlessly, listening for every sound outside. The dry wind carried whispers, and he swore he saw shadows moving at the edge of his land. His gut told him the man had not come here alone. The stars burned bright above, and still the rancher could not rest. His kindness had saved a life, but had it also doomed his own? The rancher's hands trembled as he tilted the wooden bucket, letting cool water spill slowly into the wounded native's mouth. The man coughed at first, then swallowed desperately. Like every drop was the difference between life and death. The rancher's heart pounded. His own well was running dry, his farm barely clinging to survival. And yet here he was giving away the most precious thing he had to a stranger, who might one day call him enemy. The native's eyes met his, dark and filled with both pain and dignity. No words were spoken, yet the rancher felt something powerful pass between them: gratitude, trust, perhaps even a silent vow. The rancher pressed his hand gently on the man's shoulder, whispering, "Easy now, you'll be all right." But then, a sound made his blood run cold. The earth beneath them trembled faintly. From beyond the hills came the distant thunder of hooves. The rancher froze. His mind raced. Was it a patrol of soldiers? A band of outlaws? Or was it them? The wounded native, still too weak to stand, lifted his head just enough to look toward the sound. A faint smile touched his cracked lips, as though he already knew who was coming. The rancher swallowed hard. He had acted out of kindness, but now he wondered if that choice would cost him everything. In the fading light, the dust cloud grew larger. The tremors of hooves became stronger. The rancher gripped the handle of the empty bucket, useless as a weapon, and whispered to himself, "Lord, what have I done?" The desert wind howled across the empty plain, carrying dust that stung the eyes and dried the lips. Inside his chest, the rancher's heart beat like a drum he couldn't silence. He glanced back at the small, weather-worn shack that he called home. The roof leaked, the well was nearly dry, and his last sack of beans was stretched thin. Yet here he was, kneeling on cracked earth, pouring what little water he had into the mouth of a stranger, a man who belonged to a people most settlers feared. The native's lips trembled as the cool liquid touched them. His hands, though trembling with weakness, clutched at the bucket as if it carried life itself. The rancher steadied him, whispering words the man might not even understand. "Easy now. You'll be all right. Drink slow." For a moment, time seemed to stop. The silence was broken only by the sound of water dripping and the rasp of desperate breaths. The rancher's mind swirled with questions. Who was this man? What battle had left him bleeding in the dust? And most haunting of all, was anyone watching? The sun slipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky with fire. Shadows stretched across the dry land, and with them came unease. The rancher wiped his brow, but his hand froze when he caught sight of movement in the distance. A line of riders appeared at the ridge, at first just silhouettes, then clearer, proud men on horseback, their feathers catching the dying light, their faces unreadable. 1, then 5, then 10, until the horizon itself seemed filled with them. The rancher's stomach turned cold. He had heard tales of tribes that showed no mercy to trespassers. He had heard of raids, of settlements left in ashes. And now, as the dust rose higher, he wondered if his single act of compassion had doomed him. Still, when he looked down at the wounded warrior eyes now open, faint strength returning, he felt no regret. Whatever came next, he would meet it standing. The thunder of hooves drew closer. The night grew heavier as the rancher sat by the side of his small wooden cabin, staring at the faint outline of the wounded native resting inside. He had done what his heart commanded, given water, cleaned the man's wounds, and offered shelter, but now the silence pressed down on him like a weight. Every creak of the timber, every whisper of wind against the brittle desert grass made his nerves tighten. Yet something in the warrior's exhausted eyes told a different story. When the man finally stirred, whispering words the rancher could not understand, it wasn't hatred in his tone, but gratitude. Still, fear lingered. The rancher thought of his small patch of land, his tired mule, and the handful of dried beans he called supper. He had little enough for himself, and yet he had risked all for a stranger. What if they come for me tomorrow? He murmured to the empty night. His hands shook as he poured the last of his water into a tin cup, staring at the shallow ripples. But even in his fear, he felt an odd calm, as though he had done the one right thing in a world that rarely rewarded kindness. He leaned back against the doorframe, the desert moon glowing pale above him, and listened to the labored breathing of the man he had saved. Sleep came slowly, filled with restless dreams of hoofbeats, flames, and eyes watching from the shadows. By dawn, a thin haze of dust shimmered on the horizon, and his heart sank with the knowledge that his act of mercy had already begun to shape a fate far greater than his lonely farm. His hands still damp from carrying the wounded native to safety, the rancher had fed him a little bread, given him the last drops of his well water, and for the first time in years, felt his heart lighter than his hunger. But the silence was uneasy. Every crack of a twig in the dry earth made him raise his head, listening. He knew he had crossed an invisible line. Helping a native could mean death if the tribe saw him as a meddler, and yet, leaving the man to die would have killed something inside him forever. The wind carried faint sounds, almost like whispers. The rancher's tired eyes narrowed toward the hills. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but then he saw movement. Distant figures on horseback, riding slowly in the twilight. 1, 2, then dozens. Their silhouettes grew larger, forming a line that stretched across the ridge like shadows of ancient warriors carved against the fading sun. His heart pounded. He gripped his old rifle leaning against the cabin wall, but his hand shook. What good would one rifle be against so many riders? The rancher muttered under his breath, "Lord, if this is the price for kindness, let it be paid tonight." The hoofbeats drew nearer, thunder rolling across dry earth. The dust cloud thickened, and he could see their faces now, stern, unblinking, with feathers and paint catching the last glow of daylight. Their eyes were not of strangers, but of men who had come with purpose. Inside the cabin, the wounded warrior stirred. His eyes opened weakly, and he whispered in his own tongue, words the rancher could not understand. But the look in his eyes was clear. The riders were not strangers to him. They were his people. The old rancher stood, shoulders heavy, heart racing. As the first of the mounted warriors pulled up before his fence, silence fell like a hammer. He swallowed hard, gripping his hat in both hands, waiting for judgment. What he didn't know was that this night was not the end of his story. It was only the beginning. The night dragged on, heavy with silence. The rancher sat by the dying fire, his eyes fixed on the wounded native lying on a rough blanket just outside his cabin. The man's breathing was shallow, but steadier than before. Every few moments, the rancher dipped a rag into a small bucket of water and pressed it to the man's lips. Doubt gnawed at him. What if the man doesn't survive? What if his tribe comes looking and sees me here, hovering over his body? He shook his head, forcing the thought away. He couldn't undo what he had already done. A man on the ground, dying of thirst, that wasn't an enemy. That was simply a soul in need. The wind rattled the old boards of the cabin, carrying with it the faint cry of coyotes in the distance. The rancher felt the weight of the wilderness pressing in from every side. Alone, he had always endured it. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, he was no longer alone. Toward midnight, the native stirred. His eyes opened, reflecting the dim glow of the fire. He whispered words the rancher could not understand, his tongue thick with weakness. The rancher leaned closer, catching only fragments of sound, the echo of a life lived far from his own. But he didn't need to know the language to understand the meaning. Gratitude was a thing that shone in the eyes. The rancher placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "Rest," he said softly. "You're safe here, for a moment." Their gazes locked, to men from different worlds, bound by a single act of mercy. But in the darkness beyond the cabin, unseen by the weary rancher, shadows shifted on the horizon. The rancher thought he had found peace for the night, but the eyes of the tribes were already upon him. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning he could not yet imagine.